A sharp screech of brakes and screeching tires broke the silence as the patrol car pulled up right in front of the restaurant's doors. A police officer, massive and angry as an animal, rushed out, throwing a look of hatred at the customers. His hands were shaking with excitement when he noticed a black woman sitting at a table by the window, calmly drinking coffee. He entered the hall with such force that the door slammed against the wall, drawing everyone's attention to him. "Get up, nigger," his voice resounded through the entire hall like a whip, carving shock and horror into everyone's eyes. The woman only raised her head, her calmness seeming to anger him even more. He grabbed her arm, twisting her hard behind her back, making her cry out in pain. The crowd started whispering, but no one dared to interfere. The policeman lifted her up so roughly that the chair she was sitting on bounced off, hitting the floor with a loud thud. "You think I'll let you run away, huh? You think the law will protect you? I am the law." His words were soaked with hatred, and with each blow on the floor, he pushed her harder. The woman tried to get up, but in a fit of rage, he punched her in the face so that blood spurted out of her nose. She fell down, panting, her eyes watering with pain, but she didn't make a sound, just stared at him with icy calm. "Is that all you can do? What is it?" she finally said, barely audible, and the soft voice seemed to knock the ground out from under his feet. He slammed his body against hers, wringing his hands even harder, pinning her roughly to the floor. At that moment, he pulled out his baton and savagely began hitting her on the back, on the legs, leaving her no chance to resist. But suddenly, amidst the chaos, her personal documents fell out of her pocket and appeared right in front of his eyes. He froze, his breath coming in short gasps as he saw the sign that read FBI. Medallion and ID card of a special services agent. His blood froze in his veins. This wasn't just a black woman. It was a federal agent. In an instant, his world collapsed. His face paled, and the hands that he had just used to beat her began to shake. It was his mistake. Irreversible. And now, friends, where do you watch this video from? What is your name? Have you ever experienced such brutality and racism in your life? Share your stories in the comments section. Your voice is important. Your feedback is incredibly important to us. This channel is not just about stories, it is a community of people who fight together for justice and stand up to injustice. Every comment you make, every story you tell, matters, because you're the one who helps cover what many people fear or ignore. We tell these stories to give a voice to those affected by prejudice and violence. Enjoy your viewing. The evening at the restaurant began quietly. Visitors enjoyed the aroma of food, laughter, and casual conversations. A black woman was sitting at a table by the window, poring over her smartphone, when a policeman came crashing through the door. Tall and heavy-featured, he was clearly in a bad mood. His uniform was rumpled, and his eyes were glittering with malice, as if he was looking for a victim. "Where is she?" he growled, scanning the room until his gaze landed on the woman. "You! Stand up!" Everyone froze as she raised her head, not understanding what was going on. Tension was building around them. The policeman approached her, his footsteps sounding like thunderclaps. "I said, get up." "What is it?" he repeated, and there was a hint of menace in his voice. The woman stood up, slightly embarrassed. "What's going on? Why are you bothering me? Do you know what I'm arresting you for? You're a suspect in a crime." "Stop it," he shouted, and his voice reverberated throughout the restaurant. The customers started whispering, and someone pulled out their phone to take a video of what was happening. "What crime? I didn't do anything." "No," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. But that only served to provoke the policeman. "Don't you dare tell me what to do. I see you, I know who you are." "You're all the same," he said, grabbing her arm and yanking hard. She cried out in pain as he pulled her toward the exit, leaving a trail of confusion and fear in his wake. "Don't touch me! Help! Stop it!" she shouted, but her screams blended in with the general din. Customers started to get up from their tables, and some of them clenched their fists, but were afraid to interfere. The policeman, as if feeling on top of the world, just grinned. "You thought you could get away with it, didn't you? You're just another criminal," he said as they walked out into the street. He pushed her so that she fell to the ground. "Get up. And don't you dare cry, it will only make your situation worse." "Please, I didn't do anything," she repeated, trying to get up. But he was on top of her again, pinning her to the ground with his weight. People gathered around, shocked by what was happening, but no one dared to interfere. The cops started beating her, punching her in the stomach and again until she was gasping in pain. "You deserve this, you know." "Stop it," he wheezed as her hands struggled to protect her face. "I'll make sure you remember this moment for the rest of your life." His eyes were blazing with rage, and he kept throwing punches like it was some kind of entertainment. The woman was moaning faintly, and the air smelled of fear and aggression. Finally, when he felt that she had had enough, he pulled her out by her hair and pinned her to the ground. "What's your phone number? I'll call your boyfriend to come pick you up." "Please don't do this," she managed to say. Her eyes were full of tears, but she was still fighting for herself. At that moment, the policeman, as if out of control, got down on his knees and began to hit her hard in the face. Each blow sounded like a hammer striking metal. "What a weakling you are!" "Stop it," he shouted, leaning so close to her that she could feel his breath. "You thought you could slip through? I'll break you." Then, with a wild laugh, he pulled out the handcuffs and grabbed her wrists, pulling them on with such force that she screamed in pain. "You're mine now, and no one can save you." People began to gather outside, all of them with fear and confusion on their faces. Some of them tried to say something, but the policeman only got angrier and angrier. "Go to hell!" he shouted at them, ignoring them. "It's none of your business." She lay on the ground, crying and bruised, terrified that no one had come to help her. And in that moment, when her life depended on luck, she remembered who she really was. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she said, summoning the last of her strength. There was fire in her eyes. "I'm not someone you can just humiliate." The policeman, who thought he was in control of the situation, just grinned. Yes, tell me how important you are," and hit her again. But at this moment, as she took deep breaths, she felt determination ignite inside her. Fear gripped her briefly, but she knew she could fight it. The policeman, confident of his own impunity, stood over her like a triumphant man, enjoying his power. He pressed her cheeks to the cold ground and began to push, making her gasp for breath. "Why did you come here? Ha! Do you think you can sit here and not be afraid? I'll make sure you understand what it means to respect the law." "I didn't do anything wrong," she said through gritted teeth, but his savage hand-to-hand blows cut her off. He punched her in the face again, and her nose started to bleed again. Each blow left her in a state of utter confusion and fear, but she still tried to gather her strength, screaming inwardly that she wouldn't give up. "You're just another street criminal," he continued with hatred in his voice as his knee pressed down on her back, making her moan weakly. "I'm sure you don't even know who your real father is. All of you are a product of the streets." She tried her best not to panic, but his words of contempt pricked her like needles. Every time she tried to lift her head, he pushed her back hard. "Don't you dare look at me when I'm talking. Do you know what I'll do to you?" She couldn't breathe, and her eyes filled with tears, but her inner fire, though weak, continued to burn. She knew she couldn't let this man break her. "You're wrong," she said, and her voice was hoarse but determined. With a predator's face, he leaned closer, his eyes glittering with malice. "What did you say? You think you can talk to me like that?" He grabbed her hair sharply and pulled her up so that her head jerked back. "You have no right. I can do anything to you." The crowd around them began to swell. Some people tried to take a step forward, but there was too much fear, and they just kept watching. The policeman, seeing this, only grinned. "Look at these cowards. Stop it," he shouted, as if he were performing a theater of the absurd. "No one will help you, dear." Once again, he began to beat her. The blows were brutal and merciless, and his laughter mingled with her moans. She could feel her strength leaving her, but at some point, when he swung again, she suddenly grabbed his arm and tried with all her might to push him away. This made him even angrier. "Do you really think you can resist?" His eyes filled with rage, and he hit her even harder, punching her in the stomach so hard that her breath caught in her throat. She twisted, trying to keep her body flat, but he pulled her up by her hair again and forced her to look up into his eyes. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she said through gritted teeth, though her voice was trembling with fear. "You don't know what I can do." His scowl only darkened with hatred. "What can you do? You're just another criminal I'll deal with," he said, and without thinking, he slapped her across the face, causing her head to jerk sharply to the side. She felt something crack inside, and blood began to flow down to the ground again. Shouts rang out from the crowd, but no one dared to take a step forward. The policeman, sensing the power of the power, came at her again. "If you resist, I'll make you regret it," he screamed, and started hitting her again, each blow echoing in her mind. Every kick was a mark. Every step of his feet on her back was a reminder that she was only a victim in his game. He unleashed all his hatred on her, his fists shooting out at her like lightning, leaving no chance of escape. "I'll break you. Do you understand?" An ominous whisper filled with malice rolled over her skin as he slammed into her again, driving her into the ground. But at that moment, a spark of hope lit up in her. Despite the pain, despite the fear, she knew she wouldn't give up. "I'm not the victim," she said, "despite all the blows. You can't beat me." With that, her strength began to return, and she felt her spirit begin to rise again. The policeman, feeling that his power was becoming absolute, only grinned at her words. "Do you really think this will help? You can say whatever you want, but it won't change your position," he said, holding her hair, his rough hand gripping her neck so that she could barely breathe. "You're just another black criminal who can't follow the rules. I see people like you every day," he continued, trying to break her spirit. Every time he struck, the fire of hatred flashed in his eyes, and the sound of her moans could be heard in his ears. People in the crowd started to look away, as if it was none of their business. They didn't want to get involved in something that scared them. With each blow, her body lost its strength, but somewhere deep inside her, anger flared up. "You have no right to do this to me," she said, though her voice was trembling. "Right?" he laughed. "Do you think you have rights? You're just another statistic, another problem for society. I have to get rid of the likes of you." He hits her again and again, punching her in the face so that her lips crack and blood runs down her mouth. He pinned her to the ground, his knee pressing down on her neck. "What's it like? Huh? Can't you breathe like a black man? This is your life. You chose it," he continued with contempt, not noticing that his cruelty was overstepping all bounds. The woman, feeling her strength being drained, still resisted, her thoughts sharpened despite the physical pain. The moment she tried to break free again, he threw punches again and again, leaving her no chance. Every fist that hit her body was laced with hatred and racism. "You can't get away with this. Remember this." I don't give up," she said, her voice hoarse but still full of fire. This fire, despite all the pain, made her stand up. She knew she had to fight back, even if it cost her her life. He hit her again, this time on the head, and the world began to blur. The blows became more and more brutal and merciless. "You are nothing. You're just another mistake of nature." "No," he hissed, and every blow was laced with that hatred directed against her skin color. The crowd began to separate a little. Someone finally decided to intervene and tried to get closer, but the policeman just leaned in, hissing, "Don't you dare interfere if you want everything to stay fine." His threatening tone made people retreat. With each blow, she felt her strength drain from her, but the anger inside her continued to flare up. "I'm not a criminal," she said, though her voice sounded like a whisper. "I am a human being and I deserve respect." "Respect? Do you want respect? You'll never see him again," he said with hatred, and struck again. At this moment, she felt like her world was falling apart, but she wasn't going to give up. The policeman, angry, grabbed her by the hair and pulled her up sharply, so that she was face to face with his angry gaze. "I'll make you pay for everything. You're not just a criminal. You're a disgrace. Stop it," he shouted, his voice filled with mad hatred. She closed her eyes and imagined pulling herself out of this nightmare situation. "You can't break me," she said, though her voice was trembling with pain and fear. "I'm stronger than you think." At that moment, his hand, full of malice, landed on her face again, but this time she was ready. With a force that came from within, she pulled out one hand and grabbed his wrist tightly to stop the next blow. "You can't break me. I'm fighting for myself." The policeman, stunned by her strength, stepped back a little, but his hatred only flared up. Do you think you can break out? Do you think you can stop me? Yes, she said, her voice growing stronger despite her bleeding lips and bruises. I'm not just a skin color. I'm a person with rights, and I won't let you do that. He leaned on her again, his fist coming down hard on her face again. She felt the world begin to darken again, but this time she wasn't ready to give up. Her inner fire flared up even more, even when her body was in terrible pain. I won't be a victim, she said in response to his brutality, determined even when the odds were stacked against her. The policeman, grinning maliciously, once again attacked the woman with unprecedented cruelty. His every word was laced with hatred. You are nothing. I've seen people like you hundreds of times, and every one of you does nothing but get into trouble, he said, punching her face and torso, then grabbing her hair and yanking her like a doll. You must learn to respect order. You can't just sit here like you're allowed to do anything, he continued, enjoying his power. He clearly felt triumphant in this humiliation. The people around them watched as the crowd gathered, but fear and tension gripped them. No one dared to interfere. Everyone just stared at this terrifying sight. Every time she tried to get up, he kicked her, causing her to fall back to the ground. Don't you realize that you are a nobody? Just a piece of meat that I can break. No, he growled, his voice filled with greed as he pinned her down again. She felt his weight pressing down on her, taking the last of her strength. Do you think you have rights? What is it? He asked, looking at her in disbelief. Look around you. No one will help you. All these white people are looking at you like you're an animal. You are what you are, and you are no better. He spoke as if he was in a court where he was deciding her fate. The woman let out small moans as she struggled for breath, but there was still a fire burning in her heart. I am a human being, she shouted, her voice now full of determination. I have the right to my life. His eyes flashed with anger. Just a laugh. You're not a human being. You're just a problem that needs to be fixed, he said, slapping her hard across the face again. She felt his fist meet her lips, and at that moment her mind went dark, but she gathered her strength again. I'm not afraid of you. Stop it, she shouted, her voice piercing the air despite all the pain. She knew she had to show him that she wasn't just a victim. I won't give up no matter how hard you try. What do you say when I keep you quiet forever? No, he hissed, leaning closer to her. He enjoyed the power he had over her, as if every gesture he made was part of a game. At that moment, he grabbed her wrist and pulled her down, pinning her to the ground, causing her to let out a strangled cry. I can do anything to you and no one will say a word, he said, and his voice was full of confidence. He beat her again and again, each blow a cruel reminder that she had no right to exist in his world. The crowd around them began to whisper uncertainly, and someone finally picked up the phone to record what was happening. The policeman, noticing this, broke out a new stream of threats. If any of you try to interfere, I will arrest everyone. No one will be my enemy, and you, pointing to the woman, will pay for it. Why are you doing this? No, she said, her voice barely breaking through her ragged breaths. I'm not to blame for my flowers. I'm just a woman. I'm just a man. You're just another skin I can beat up. And I love it, he said with a smile, feeling his power. Each blow, each whisper of hatred, only served to fuel his desire. She could feel everything darkening around her, but anger was burning in her soul. You can't break me, she said, even as his fist came down on her again, leaving a trail of violence on her face. I'm fighting for the truth. I'm fighting for my life. For your life? He chuckled, and his laughter was like the sound of madness. You're just a joke being played out in front of my eyes. You should have known that there would be a price to pay for this at some point. Pay? For what? What is it? She asked, trying her patience, but at the same time not letting her fear get the better of her. I'm not going to stand by and watch you humiliate me. With that, she mustered the last of her strength for a moment and pulled her arm out of his grasp. This surprised him, but not for long. What are you going to do? You're nothing. You're just a black woman in my arms, he growled as he swooped down on her again. But at that moment, she used her strength to finally get to her knees. I won't let you break my spirit, she screamed as she knelt there, determined despite all the horror she had endured. Every blow, every humiliation, only spurred her on. I am fighting not only for myself, but for all those who were speechless in the face of such cruelty. His eyes filled with hatred, and he didn't understand how it was possible that his victim, his captive, could speak like that. You can't resist. I'll do whatever I want with you, and no one will stop me. The crowd around them began to whisper and move closer, and this support rather embarrassed the policeman. She could feel the power building up inside her that he couldn't break. He took her by the shoulders and threw her to the ground again, but now she had support. "Look at this racist brutality," someone shouted from the crowd, and that was what she needed. She felt her fear fade and her resolve begin to prevail. "I'm not just a victim, I am a woman, and I deserve justice." Speaking out loud gave her new strength, and she was ready to fight for herself and for all those who suffered from hatred and violence. She knew that this wasn't just her fight, but a fight for all the souls who couldn't raise their voices. "I won't give up." "What is it?" she repeated, knowing that at this moment, despite all the cruelty, she was ready to fight to the end. The crowd around them continued to swell, and one black woman stood out from the audience. She couldn't stand the humiliation and stepped forward, determined to stop the cop. "Hey, that's enough. What are you doing?" "It's not her fault what's happening," she shouted, her voice firm and confident. The cop heard her and turned around with an evil grin. "Are you interfering? Do you think you can stop me? You and your friend are here, just another mistake of nature," he said, pointing at the woman lying on the ground. "She's not a criminal, she was just sitting here, just like the rest of us. You have no right to do this." The new arrival continued to protest, her eyes filled with determination and anger. She stepped forward, trying to put a barrier between the cop and the victim, but the cop just grinned. "Get your dirty hands off her," she screamed, looking into the policeman's eyes, filled with hatred for his cruelty. "You're humiliating her just because of her skin color." The policeman, noticing that her words were beginning to attract the attention of the crowd, rushed towards her, glaring into her eyes. "You black girl, don't you dare tell me what to do. You don't have a license. You're just another skin color that interferes with normal people's lives," he hissed, his voice filled with hatred and contempt. "I'm a human, I have the right," she shouted back, her voice filled with anger and determination. "You don't have the right to humiliate her just because of the color of her skin. It's not your right to decide who's human and who's not." He suddenly grabbed her by the sleeve and yanked her violently towards him, causing her to stagger. "Don't you dare speak out against me. Do you think your voice matters? You're just another animal, just like her," he said, squeezing her hand so hard that she moaned in pain. The woman, still holding herself together, looked at her opponent with disdain. "You're wrong, and everyone will see it. You're a disgrace to your uniform. You're a disgrace to the police." The crowd around them froze, and someone took a step forward, but fear of the policeman held them back. The policeman sensed this, and his confidence increased. "Look at these poor things, they don't understand what order is. And all of you," he pointed to the crowd, "just confirm that you are nothing." At this time, he again attacked a black woman standing in defense of her friend. "And you, foolish one, will get the same. I can easily get you out of here. You think you can interfere with my work?" he shouted, raising his hand as if he was going to hit her. "I'm not afraid of you. You're only humiliating yourself. Stop it," she shouted, but at that moment, his fist swiftly met her face, and she fell to the ground, gasping in surprise. "Shut up, black skin. Stop it," he hissed, standing over her. "You don't have the right to open your mouth. And you," he pointed to the woman on the ground. "Do you think you mean anything? You're just a toy in my hands, and I'll do whatever I want with you." The woman lying on the ground felt the police officer's hatred pierce her to the core. "Please stop," she said, her voice quieter now, but there was still a spark of hope in it. "We are not criminals. We're just people, and you should understand that. I don't have to do anything." "Stop it," he shouted, slapping her across the face again. "Do you think you can change anything? You're just another black fringe in this society, and I'm the one who decides who should live and who shouldn't." The woman who got up from the ground felt her strength begin to leave her. She was full of anger and ready to fight. "You don't have the right to decide who is worthy of life. We all have the right," she shouted, and her words finally caught the attention of the other people in the crowd. "You are all nobodies," the policeman hissed, as if the entire crowd was standing in front of him. "You only confirm that I'm right. I won't let you interfere." The crowd froze, not knowing how to react. The woman, coming to the defense of her friend, felt that her inner fire was igniting, but the fear of the policeman held her down. "We are not silent while such brutality continues. Stop it," she shouted to the crowd. "We all deserve the best, and we should support each other." The policeman was even angrier when he saw the others slowly approaching them. "Do you want to get the same thing?" he shouted as he prepared to charge again. "No, we won't be scared. We stand for justice," the black woman replied, her voice sounding confident, filling the people in the crowd with determination. But the policeman, sensing a threat from the crowd, raised his baton and rushed towards them, threatening them, "Get out or I'll arrest you all. I'll do the same to you as I did to them," he shouted as hatred continued to ignite in his heart. No one knew what to do. Everyone felt fear, but at the same time, brave voices began to appear among the crowd, determined to speak out against racism and violence. These words encouraged the woman on the ground, and she stood up, standing up for herself and her friend. "We won't give up. We will fight." Her words stirred up anger in the hearts of the people, and they slowly began to gather, ready to support each other against hatred and cruelty. The policeman, sensing that the situation was getting out of hand, yelled, "Get out! I am the law!" "No, you're a disgrace," the woman shouted, and the crowd, emboldened by her courage, began to move toward him, ready to stand up for the truth despite the threats and hatred coming from him. The policeman, seeing that the crowd was beginning to rally and support the black women, flew into a rage. His face was flushed red with anger, and he abruptly walked towards the one in front, full of determination. "You think you can just come and stand in my way? Stop it," he hissed, approaching her with a menacing look. "I'm not afraid of you," she said firmly, but inwardly she was afraid. "You are just a man in uniform, and I know that you have no right to humiliate others." "Don't have the right?" He laughed, his laughter filled with disdain. "You black skin don't know what you're saying. I have all the power to do anything to you. I can leave you lying on the ground and no one will say a word. Do you think your uniform gives you the right to do everything? Stop it," she screamed, feeling anger grow inside her. "We will not tolerate this humiliation." "Humiliation? You yourself are a humiliation," he exclaimed, his voice filled with hatred. He suddenly grabbed her wrist, yanking her toward him, causing her to stagger. "You're just another mistake in this society. I don't respect you and I never will." The crowd around them froze. Some started whispering, but no one dared to interfere. The police officer, who felt that he was in control of the situation, continued to threaten, "If any of you try to help this silent doll, I will arrest all of you. I am the law, and I will do what I see fit." The woman, on the verge of despair, replied to him with disdain, "You are not the law. You are a manifestation of hatred and racism, and I know that the truth will be on our side." At that moment, the policeman, not wanting to hear her words, forcefully pushed her to the ground. She fell, and her breath caught in her throat. "You want to know why I hate people like you?" he said, leaning toward her. "Because all you do is create problems. You are all incapable of anything good." The crowd erupted in anger, but fear of the policeman kept them out of the way. "Watch this black woman humiliate herself," he continued, his voice full of malice. "You're all the same. You should be grateful that we are even giving you a chance to exist in this world. You are the one who should be humiliated," one of the women in the crowd shouted, and this spurred the others on. Their hatred for the policeman was growing, and although they were afraid, they now understood that they could no longer remain silent. The woman lying on the ground felt a fire ignite inside her. "I'm not going to be silent. I'm fighting for my rights." "Stop it," she shouted, struggling to her knees. The policeman laughed, but there was already fear in it. "Just a laugh. You're naive if you think your struggle will change anything. You're just another victim." "We are not victims," she replied, her voice growing more confident. "We are human beings, and we have voices that need to be heard." At that moment, another black woman who had previously tried to protect the first one stood up next to her. "We are together, and we will not be broken. You can't just throw out threats and try to intimidate us." The policeman, seeing that they were rallying, lost control of himself. "All you black women can do is yell and complain. You don't belong in this society," he shouted, clenching his fists in anger. "You're just a sign of a system that doesn't work. We will fight for the truth," the first woman replied, her voice determined. The crowd finally decided to perform. "How much more violence and hatred can we endure?" A voice rang out from the crowd. "We won't let this continue." The policeman, realizing that he was losing control of the situation, tried to push the woman away again, but now the crowd did not stay away. "Get out of here. We won't let you humiliate us," they shouted, and their words were filled with anger and determination. The woman, on her knees, realized that this was her chance. "Can you hear me? Stop it," she shouted, her voice filled with power. "We will not give up until justice is served." The crowd, inspired by her words, began to rise. "Justice," they shouted, and the cry sounded as one. breaking the atmosphere of fear and hatred that reigned around them. The policeman, confused, began to take steps back. "Don't come near me, I'll arrest you," he shouted, but his voice didn't sound as confident as before. "You won't arrest anyone. Your days of being able to do this with impunity are coming to an end," the black woman replied, and there was a hint of challenge in her words. The situation was escalating. The policeman's hatred clashed with the crowd's determination. People began to move forward, united in their desire to stop violence and racism. "We are together, and we are not afraid anymore," they shouted, raising their voices against the evil that had oppressed them for so long. The policeman, realizing that his time was running out, took a step back, but it wasn't just one black woman who was standing in front of him. It was a whole movement full of determination and strength, ready to fight for truth and justice. In the midst of a tense situation, as the crowd moves forward united in their determination, the policeman suddenly noticed that one of the women standing in front of him was not dressed like the others. There was something about her demeanor, confidence, and calmness that didn't match up with those he usually met in situations like this. Suddenly it dawned on him. He recalled that today, while he was on duty, a call was received about several FBI agents who were trying to establish undercover how the police were treating residents of the area. "Wait a minute," he said, squinting at her intently. "Who are you really?" The woman in front of him met his gaze with unwavering determination. "I am the one who came to stop your actions. I'm not your victim." "Don't tease me, Blackie," he shouted, but his voice didn't sound as confident now. Anxiety was beginning to build inside him. "You're just one of many people trying to get in my way, and I can easily get you out of the way." At that moment, he noticed her slowly pull out her badge. "I'm an FBI agent," she said, and her voice was cold and hard as steel. "And you're making a big mistake right now if you think you can just get away with bullying us." The crowd froze, and the tension in the air became even more palpable. The policeman frowned, his heart beating faster. "What did you say?" he hissed in disbelief. "You heard me. I work for the FBI, and I'm here to monitor your actions," she replied, her eyes shining with confidence. "All your actions are recorded, and you can't hide what you did." "No, no, no, stop it," he shouted, now in a panic. "You have no right. You're just lying." "I'm not lying," she said calmly, moving closer. "Not only are you exceeding your authority, but you are also breaking the law. You've become the one we need to stop. This can't be happening. I am the law. I'm a cop." He tried to justify himself, but he knew that his words were losing their power. The crowd, caught up in her words, began to flare up. "You are not the law," one woman shouted. "You're just a rapist hiding behind a badge." The policeman, looking at the crowd, began to realize that they were not just present, but ready to support their sister, even if it meant going against him. "I'm not afraid of you all," he shouted, but his confidence was gone. "You're not only in danger now, but you're also under surveillance," the woman said, her voice determined. "The FBI already knows about your actions, and they'll send reinforcements if you don't stop." At that moment, he felt fear tighten in his chest. "How did you know?" "It's not that simple." He tried to justify himself, but it was obvious that his time was running out. "Your actions are documented. You can't just humiliate people and assume that it will go unnoticed," she said, and there was a confidence in her voice that spurred the crowd on. The cop looked around, his eyes darting from one woman to the next. "You will all be responsible for this," he shouted as he raised his baton, preparing for further action. But the crowd, seeing his fear and hatred, became even more determined. "We stand together, and you can't bully us," one of the women shouted, raising her fist. "We are not victims, we are fighters for our rights," another one shouted, and there was a power in her voice that encouraged others. The policeman finally realized that his power was disappearing. "I'll arrest you," he whispered, but there was no longer any confidence in his voice. "For what? For standing up for the truth?" the black woman replied, her voice filled with determination. "You can't arrest people just for fighting hate." The policeman, sensing that the situation was getting out of hand, started to step back. "I'm not going to stay here. I'll call for backup," he exclaimed, but now his fear surpassed his hatred. "It's too late," the woman said, her confidence infectious. "You've already fallen into the trap. You will not escape responsibility." The gathered people began to approach him, creating a barrier around him. "We won't let you leave," they shouted. The policeman, finally realizing that his time was up, ran for the exit, but the crowd was already closing in on him. "You won't leave so easily," one woman shouted, raising her hand. "It won't happen again," a black woman said from the foreground. "You will all be responsible for this," he shouted, but now it sounded like a pathetic threat, not a certainty. "Now is your hour of reckoning." "What is it?" she said, and there was a challenge in her voice. At this point, the policeman, realizing that his power and confidence were falling apart, began to look around in panic, realizing that everything he thought he had was slipping away from him. He was no longer a sworn enemy, he was only a man who feared for his fate. The cop, realizing that he was facing an FBI agent, instantly felt a surge of fear and panic. His confidence, which had once allowed him to feel like the ultimate master of the situation, was beginning to fade. He didn't know how to react to the fact that this woman, whom he thought was weak and defenseless, was not only his equal, but also his opponent with powers that he couldn't ignore. "What are you up to?" he said with a tremor in his voice, taking a step back. "You're just another aggressive citizen who decided to rebel. But you can't stop me. I'm a cop." "You forget who really has the power here," she replied calmly, her eyes shining with confident determination. "You have no right to use force against me or any other woman. And trust me, I know how to do it." The crowd, watching the policeman begin to lose control, felt a surge of strength. The woman in front of him knew this was her moment. "Do you think your uniform and baton make you strong?" "What is it?" she asked, her voice sounding like thunder. "Actually, it makes you weak, because you're afraid of justice." The policeman, trying to regain his position, shook his head. "I know you don't have the right to do this. You don't have the authority to threaten me. I'll call for backup and they won't listen to you." "Do you really think that someone will come to save you?" she said with a slight grin. "I've already notified you. Everything you did was recorded. You have no choice." At this moment, other women from the crowd started to get up and approach her. "You can do whatever you want, but we're all here to support her," one of them shouted. "You can't bully us." "Yes, you can't, yes," said another. "You have no power over us, and you know it." The policeman, realizing that he was surrounded not just by a crowd, but by a cohesive movement, felt his fear and anger begin to turn into despair. He looked around, realizing that his own people might not support him here. "You don't know who you're dealing with. Stop it," he shouted, but there was no longer the same strength in his voice. "We understand who you are," the woman in the front replied. "You are an example of a system that needs to change, and we won't let you keep doing what you're doing." The policeman, feeling that he had no arguments left, darted back as if looking for a way out. "I'll leave, and you'll all regret it," he shouted, but it sounded the same as before, like a last-ditch attempt to save face. The woman in the foreground raised her hand and said, "Don't think you can just run away. Your actions will not go unpunished. We know how to stop you." The policeman, realizing that he had nowhere to run, began to tremble. "What do you mean? What is it?" he asked, no longer able to hide his fear. "You can't threaten me. I know my rights." "You broke your own rules," she said, taking a step toward him. "You used your power to bully and humiliate, and now it's time to answer for it." The crowd, caught up in her energy, shouted, "Justice, justice," and the sound of these words rang out like thunder in the silence. The policeman, realizing that this was not just a group of people, but a movement full of determination, felt his confidence fade. "You are not the law," she said, now standing so close that he could see his fear reflected in her eyes. "You are the criminal, and I am the one who will bring you to justice." At that moment, he lost the last of his control and pulled out his baton, but this only spurred the crowd on. "Don't you dare do that," one of the women shouted. "You will only confirm that you are the source of violence." The policeman froze, realizing that every attempt he made to intimidate them only made his situation worse. "You can't do this," he said, but his voice was getting fainter and fainter. "You can't get away from us," she said with confidence, her voice resonating with the power that everyone around her felt. "We are here to stop this. You can't continue to humiliate people and hope that everything goes unpunished." Finally, he realized that he had no power. He found himself face to face with a woman who, despite his threats, not only wasn't afraid of him, but was also willing to fight for justice. At that moment, he realized that his time was up, and he could no longer be the person he thought he was before. The crowd, seeing his confusion, raised their heads higher, They felt that this was their victory. "We are together," one of the women shouted, and the cry was full of hope. The policeman, now aware that his world was falling apart, didn't know what to do. A police officer standing face to face with a female FBI agent felt his life changing rapidly. His bat in hand was shaking, and he realized that he had lost control of the situation. With each passing second, it became more and more obvious to him that he had no chance against this close-knit crowd, which now felt the power of unity. "You think you can just leave?" she said, and her voice was like a thunderbolt. "You are a symbol of a system that is losing its legitimacy every day. We will not tolerate your actions any longer." He looked at her, but there was no longer any fear in her eyes. She knew that she had support, and that was what finally undermined his confidence. "I'm a cop," he tried to justify himself again, but his voice now sounded like a cry of despair. "I'm doing my job. You don't know who you're dealing with." "No, you don't understand," the woman said, taking a step closer. "We understand that you are just a tool of a system that has oppressed people for years, and now it's time for you to answer for it." The crowd, caught up in her rhetoric, shouted, "Justice, justice." They could feel the energy filling the atmosphere, their voices drowning out the sounds of fear and violence. The policeman, realizing that his time was up, looked around sharply, trying to find a way out of the encirclement. "I'll call for backup," he shouted, but his words didn't sound as confident anymore. He knew that if he called for help, it would only be to see how they would support his opponents. "You can't hide behind your badge," the woman screamed. "We've already recorded everything you've done. This video is everywhere now. You can't just leave. You don't know what you were doing." He tried to challenge her, but it sounded plaintive. "I defend the law." "And what law are you defending? The law of violence? The law of oppression? You stopped being a defender, and now you're a criminal." Her words resonated in the hearts of the audience. He noticed that a few people from the crowd were starting to climb closer to him. "Let's make him realize that he has nowhere to run," one of the men said, his voice filled with anger. Once again, the cop felt a wave of panic creep over him. "No, please," he shouted as several women took a step forward. "I can't arrest you. I'm not going to touch you." "You've already touched us," one of them said, her voice full of power. "You've already tarnished your reputation, and now we're here to stop it." The policeman, realizing that his threats and violence no longer worked, suddenly remembered about his phone. He tried to grab it, but his movements were too slow. The woman in front of him stopped him with her hand. "Stay away from the phone. We all saw how you treated her. There will be no excuse." The crowd around them began to exchange glances, realizing that all this time the policeman had remained in the shadow of his authority. "We are all here to show that we will not tolerate this kind of attitude anymore," one of the women said, her voice sounding like a sentence. The policeman, confused and frightened, looked at the black woman who was next to him. "I didn't mean it. I was just doing my duty," he said, but his words no longer carried any weight. "You can't do your job when you're breaking the law," she said, her voice brimming with confidence. "Your actions were inappropriate, and now you will answer for it." At that moment, he realized that his defense system had collapsed. The crowd, made up of those he had once considered inferior, now looked like a single entity, and he, despite his uniform and baton, found himself in the role of the oppressed. "This isn't your world right now," the female agent said, stepping forward confidently. "Now you're just a shadow of your actions, and it's time to answer for it." The policeman, realizing that he had no choice, suddenly threw the baton on the ground and raised his hands. "Good, I give up," he shouted, but that didn't mean he wasn't afraid anymore. It was just an attempt to save face. "We know you're afraid," she replied, her voice full of determination, "but now you must understand that your actions will not go unpunished. We're all here to stop it, and you will no longer rape and oppress." The crowd, seeing his confusion, shouted, "Justice." They felt that this moment would be a turning point in their struggle. The policeman, surrounded by people who were no longer afraid of him, began to realize that his time was up. His world, which he had considered untouchable, was falling apart before his eyes, and now he couldn't do anything about it. He lost control of the situation and, most importantly, of himself. The policeman, surrounded by the anger and determination of the crowd, realized that his position had become unbearable. Every face that looked at him with disapproval increased his fear. He held up his hands as if that would somehow save him from the inevitable reckoning. "Please, I'm really sorry," he said, his voice shaking with panic. I didn't mean to offend anyone, he continued, referring to the black woman he had just humiliated. You have to understand, I was just doing my job. It wasn't directed at you. I just didn't know how it felt. His words sounded empty, but the fire of hatred and disdain still raged inside him. He couldn't afford to admit that he was wrong. Instead, he tried to pin the blame on the system that, in his opinion, pushed him to such actions. I always thought I was defending the law. I didn't mean to offend anyone, he added, but as he felt the crowd tense up, his voice became even fainter. Apologize for what you did, one of the women shouted, clenching her fists. Apologize for the humiliation. Apologize for the violence. The cop, feeling the eyes on him, turned back to the female agent. Please just give me a chance. I can fix everything. I can help you. His eyes filled with tears, but it wasn't genuine remorse. It was just a desire to survive. You can't undo what you've already done, she said, and there was a force in her voice that filled the air. You must understand that you are now facing the consequences of your actions. Apologize not just to me, but to everyone you've humiliated. He looked at the others, but instead of supporting them, all he saw was contempt and hatred. I really didn't mean to. I thought it was the right thing to do. I didn't know. Stop it, he shouted, realizing that he was losing all hope of forgiveness. The crowd just stared at him with hatred. You created this situation yourself, and now you need to answer for it. One of the women shouted. You can't just leave. The policeman, unable to bear the strain, suddenly fell to his knees. Please, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. His voice sounded desperate, but his inner thoughts were still struggling. He still thought he was right, but now that he was in such a vulnerable position, fear made him say things that seemed to save him. You're wrong, and you know it, the woman in front of him said. You used your power to intimidate and humiliate, and now you have to answer for it. You're not a cop anymore, but a criminal. No, he shouted, his face contorted with fear. I'm not a criminal. I didn't want this. It was all wrong. Please. But the woman didn't answer, and her silence said more than any words. A struggle raged inside the policeman. He felt cornered, and even though his voice said one thing, his mind whispered to him that he was still right. I was just defending the law, he muttered, but now it sounded like a weak excuse. The crowd didn't respond to his pleas. You won't scare us, one of the women shouted, her voice brimming with confidence. You can't get away with this. The policeman, seeing them continue to approach, felt his fear turn to rage. It's going to be bad for you all. I know who you are. I can arrest you. It was a last-ditch attempt to save face, but the words didn't make any impression on the crowd. Arrest us for what? For standing up for the truth? The female agent said, her eyes flashing with anger. You are the one who should be arrested. You are the epitome of what we are fighting against. The policeman finally felt his confidence finally vanish. He realized, frightened and confused, that no one would be on his side. I just wanted things to be right. No, he said, and there was no longer the same strength in his voice. It's time to learn what it means to be human, the black woman said, and her words resonated in the hearts of everyone present. We all deserve respect. And you, too. The policeman felt his strength drain out of him as the surroundings became increasingly oppressive. Despite his desire to continue resisting, he knew that his fight was over. He was left alone with his conscience, and this fight was the hardest of all. I'm not sure how to fix this, he said, and in that moment, he felt the weight of everything he'd done weigh down on him. You need to start with genuine remorse, the woman said, her voice sounding like a call for justice. You need to understand that we are here to fight for our freedom and our rights. The policeman, lowering his head, felt that his inner world was collapsing. He didn't know who he was anymore, and that was the worst part. The moment he realized that his actions had consequences, he knew that he would not be able to hide from his guilt. A few months later, after a police officer finally admitted his guilt in front of the entire crowd, a female FBI agent who has become a symbol of the fight against racism and violence decided to act. She knew that it wasn't enough to just put the situation behind her. There was a burning desire in her heart to change the system so that no one else would experience what she had experienced. She gathered her thoughts and began the process of filing a lawsuit against the police officer. It wasn't an easy decision, but she knew it was necessary to get justice, not only for myself, but for all those who have suffered from systemic oppression. While she was preparing the documents, She was joined by other women who became her allies in this case. Each of them had a different story about how the police violated their rights and oppressed them. "We need to show that this is not an isolated incident," she told them as they gathered in a small cafe to discuss plans. "We must unite and make sure that the world knows about this." Each of them brought their own story and their own evidence. A woman who once became a victim of police brutality shared her notes. Others brought videos made by eyewitnesses that showed how police officers used their power to intimidate and humiliate. "We're not just suing this person," she said. "We are suing the system that allows these things to happen." After collecting all the necessary documents, she and her allies went to court. Her heart was pounding as they entered the hall. The hall was full. Anticipation hung in the air, and she sensed that this time she wasn't alone. The people who had come to support her were standing in the corner, ready to intercede. When the hearing began, the police officer who had once humiliated her was sitting in the dock looking scared and confused. He didn't seem to be the confident person he used to be. He looked weak now, as if all his strength had been knocked out of him. The woman spoke first. She couldn't contain her emotions as she talked about what happened that day at the restaurant. "I came to this restaurant just to have dinner," she began, her voice shaking, "but instead, I ended up being targeted by a police officer who thought he could treat me as he pleased." With every word she said, the people in the audience began to feel a sense of tension. Some of them whispered their disapproval of the police officer's actions. She went on to describe how he used force, humiliated her, and used his power against her. "He not only insulted me, but also insulted everyone who suffers from racism," she said. The judge listened intently, taking down every word. The policeman sat with his head bowed, his face a mixture of shame and fear. "I can't let this continue," she finished, her voice sounding determined. "I demand justice, not only for myself, but for all those who have ever suffered such a thing." When she was done, her allies approached the podium, each sharing a different story. The audience was filled with emotional stories about the suffering and humiliation they had endured. It was a powerful moment of unity that awakened people's understanding and desire to fight injustice. The policeman, seeing how all these women seemed to unite into one powerful voice, started to get nervous. He knew that his actions were wrong, and now that the public had heard the stories, he couldn't hide behind his uniform anymore. In the end, when all was said, there was silence. The judge looked up, and the entire room was waiting. "I will make my decision based on the evidence and evidence presented," he said. "This case is not just about you, but also about the justice and justice that should exist in our society." The woman felt a surge of excitement as the judge began to consider the facts. She knew this was just the beginning, and even as fear rose in her throat, she could feel the strength of her struggle. She and her allies were willing to continue fighting for their rights, even if it meant facing the system that had oppressed them for so long. The judge finally delivered his verdict. "After careful consideration of the evidence presented, I decide that the actions of the police officer were unfounded and violated the rights of a citizen." Whispers filled the room. The woman felt her heart pounding in her chest. "I order an investigation to be launched against this police officer, and if he is found guilty, he will be punished according to the law," the judge added. The crowd erupted in cheers and cheers. The female agent, standing among her allies, felt tears of joy fill her eyes. This wasn't just her personal achievement, it was proof that they could fight and win. With this victory, a new chapter in her life began, and she knew that now she was not just a victim, but a symbol of hope and strength. Every step they took, every voice they raised, became part of the fight for justice. She knew that this was just the beginning, and she still had a lot of work to do. But at that moment, standing among her allies, she felt that they could change the world. After the sentencing, a police officer who once felt invincible found himself in a terrible position. The verdict of the court hit him like a cold wind, and as he left the courtroom, he knew that his life had changed forever. When he went outside, he was met by reporters rushing to ask him questions. "How do you feel after the court decision?" "What is it?" they asked. "What are you going to do next?" His face contorted with tension, and he felt a surge of excitement as the cameras focused on him. I don't want to talk," he muttered, trying to avoid their eyes. He knew that his actions were now under intense scrutiny. People who once thought of him as a hero now looked at him with disdain and condemnation. Shortly after the trial, He was summoned for questioning by the HR department. "We have reason to believe that your actions did not meet the standards of our police," the chief said. His voice was cold and emotionless, as if he was talking about some common rule violation. "In this regard, we are launching an internal investigation." The policeman could feel the ground slipping under his feet. "But I was doing my job. I defended the law," he shouted, but his words didn't make any impression. "You knew that your actions were illegal, and now you have to answer for them," the boss continued. "Temporary measures include suspending your license and service." With every word his superior said, the cop felt his world crumble. His pride, his identity, his job, all of it became inaccessible. Later, sitting in an empty bar, he tried to drown out his feelings with alcohol. "I didn't do anything wrong," he whispered to himself, but the words no longer seemed true. He began to realize that his former position of power no longer existed. With every sip of alcohol, he could feel anger and hatred boiling up inside him. "These women, they're just trying to break me," he thought. He couldn't accept that it wasn't just his own personal fault, but part of the system he was maintaining. But the more he drank, the more obvious it became that his hatred no longer brought him relief. He became the target of ridicule among his former colleagues, many of whom now shunned him. "It's your fault for what's happening," they said behind her back. Gradually, his life began to collapse. He lost his job, his family moved away, and his friends refused to support him. He was no longer a cop, but a shadow of himself, forced to live in shame. A few months after the trial, he met the female agent again at the very restaurant where it all started. She went there with a group of her allies, and their laughter filled the air like music. The policeman, sitting by the window, looked at them, and his heart was filled with hatred and envy. "How can they be happy after everything I've done?" he thought, feeling his rage rise up inside him. The idea that he needed to do something about revenge was forming in his mind. He began to write down their names and faces, planning how he could regain his power. However, this hatred only further destroyed him. He became isolated and sullen, and over time, his mental state worsened. He stopped caring about his appearance, and soon his life turned into an endless stream of alcohol and despair. One night, after a particularly hard day, he decided that he couldn't take it anymore. He came to the place where he once worked, and, being in the deserted site, felt a dull melancholy. He looked down at the awards and diplomas that had once been his pride, and realized that he no longer had the right to them. That was the last straw. He left his badge on the table and went outside, feeling a cold wind enter his soul. He knew he had nowhere to go now. He had lost everything he had, and that was a consequence of his own actions. As soon as he disappeared from the station, his thoughts became even darker. There were voices in his head that constantly reminded him of his failures, how he was once a defender and now a villain. He realized that no one would come to his aid, and in solitude, his hatred only grew. Meanwhile, the female agent continued her fight. She began holding seminars and lectures, teaching others about human rights and the importance of combating racism. Her voice has become a symbol of hope for many. The people she inspired started coming together, and their movement grew. She knew her case wasn't over yet, and the cop was just part of her fight for justice. She understood that it was stories like hers that could change the world, and while she felt sorry for what he had become, her heart had no room for hatred. She was determined to keep moving forward, fighting for her siblings who were also victims of the system. While she was building a new society based on equality and justice, the policeman, lost in his dark thoughts, realized that he was in the past, in a world that he had destroyed with his own hands. The policeman who had lost everything was sitting in a dark corner of his small, run-down apartment, full of ashes from extinguished cigarettes and empty bottles. Dark thoughts of revenge were forming in his mind. He couldn't let this woman, an FBI agent, humiliate him and walk away victorious. "She ruined my life," he whispered to himself, knowing that he felt helpless and lost. With each passing day, his hatred for her only grew, and he began to make a plan. He knew that she had enemies in the police department, and that her official position always put her at risk. He began to gather information about her, observing her behavior, studying her daily routine. Every morning, she left the house early to go to work. He watched her, noting her every move. "She has to pay for what she did to me," he thought, as his plan grew more concrete. He also recalled some of his old acquaintances who were unhappy with her actions in court. They might be able to help him. He began to track them down, urging them to join in his revenge. Together, they could intimidate her, make her feel the fear she had caused him. His inner voice whispered to him that this was the only way to regain his lost power and dignity, and even though he knew in his heart that this was wrong, hatred consumed him. It wasn't just a desire for revenge, it became his only goal. Having prepared everything, he felt a surge of confidence. Now he knew that he could make her life unbearable. She would be a victim of her own decisions, and that was a comfort to him. The time of reckoning is coming, he thought, imagining her fear becoming his new strength. The policeman, filled with anger and a thirst for revenge, began to carry out his plan. First of all, he contacted several old acquaintances who had their own reasons for hating the female agent. They were all unhappy with the way she exposed police brutality and got justice. The cop knew that by teaming up with them, they could create a real threat to her. Collecting information, he began to gather information about her routine. He would sit in the shade for hours, watching her house, recording when she went out and came back, where she worked, and who was around her. He found out that she had several friends who also supported her fight, and decided that they should also be intimidated. Bullying. The next step was physical intimidation. The policeman gathered his allies and organized several acts of intimidation. One evening, when a woman was returning from work, they were waiting for her at her entrance. "Hey, agent, did you think you got off easy?" one of his friends shouted as she approached the door. The policeman and his companions surrounded her, making threats. "We know who you are, and we won't let you get away with it," he said, trying to sound confident. They didn't intend to cause her any serious harm, but the fear and depression they were trying to cause was obvious. Damaging your reputation. After that, he decided to undermine her reputation. He started spreading rumors about her among colleagues and in the police department, claiming that she was a traitor who used her official position to suppress her fellow tribesmen. He bullied and bullied her enemies into supporting his slander. His tactics worked. Soon, many people began to avoid her, and she became an object of hatred in some circles. He could feel the satisfaction of revenge, even though he knew deep down that it wasn't the solution. Provocation of the conflict. The police officer continued to act, provoking conflicts to further destabilize her life. He arranged for several of her allies to be reprimanded at work. One day, he even arranged for her to fall into a trap with corrupt police officers who worked for him. These actions were part of his plan to completely ruin her life. He thought that if he could get her off balance, she would start making bad decisions on her own, which would only make things worse for her. Dark premonition. However, despite his success, deep down the policeman felt that this would not lead to real satisfaction. He was sinking deeper into a world of hate and malice, and even though the plan was working, he couldn't shake the feeling that his revenge hadn't made him stronger. Instead, it only served to exacerbate his own inner demons. The policeman began to realize that revenge would not bring him happiness, and perhaps in the end he would only ruin himself, but it was too late to stop. Now he was stuck in his own evil, and thoughts of vengeance never left him. As time went on, the policeman became more and more involved in his dark revenge. His actions seemed to be working, but inside, he could feel the exhausting stress and anxiety taking hold of him. The female agent, although under pressure and intimidation, continued to stand firm. She knew that despite all the threats, she had to continue her fight for justice. The climax. One day, when she was returning from an important meeting, the policeman and his friends decided that it was time to move on to more drastic measures. They were waiting for her outside the office, ready to intimidate her and possibly even harm her. At this point, however, things didn't go according to plan. When they surrounded her, fortunately, there were other FBI agents nearby who noticed that something was wrong. They immediately intervened, and the situation quickly spiraled out of control for the police officer and his friends. Instead of intimidating the woman, they were arrested themselves. Exposure and consequences. As a result of the proceedings, it became clear that the police officer acted not only illegally, but also thoughtlessly, putting at risk not only the FBI agent, but also his former colleagues. His actions are now being investigated not only in terms of his own misdeeds, but also in the context of broader corrupt police activities. Soon the police officer was stripped of his license and arrested. He found himself in a prison where not only other prisoners were waiting for him, but also constant memories of how he once used his power and authority to oppress others. Now that he was alone, he realized the futility of his actions and how they had backfired on him. While the police officer spent her days behind bars, the female agent continued her work, strengthening the fight against racism and systemic violence in the police. She did everything possible to help those who suffered from arbitrariness. Thanks to her efforts, many people began to talk about problems that had long remained in the shadows. Over time, her story became known nationally, inspiring others to take action and change. She freed her soul from hatred and resentment by turning to deeds that changed the lives of others. The cop, in the dark prison of his own decisions, finally realized that revenge had given him neither power nor respect. He had lost everything, and all that remained was his hatred, a heavy, persistent shadow that he had created for himself. Thus ended the story of revenge and racism, but a new chapter began for the woman who, despite all the difficulties, continued to shine as a symbol of hope and strength. She knew that the fight wasn't over yet, but with every step she took, she was getting closer to justice. The current situation served as a powerful reminder of how hatred can destroy not only those who fall victim to it, but also those who feed it. The police officer, entangled in his own mistakes, was left alone with what he had done and could not avoid the consequences of his actions. His decision to take revenge led to his own downfall, and he was left isolated, wondering where he had lost himself. The female agent, having overcome all the difficulties, realized that the struggle for justice is not just a personal matter, but a collective task that requires courage and perseverance. She continued to inspire others, demonstrating that even in the darkest of times, there is hope for a brighter future. Her every step was a step towards change, and her name became a symbol of the struggle against oppression and injustice. She knew that true power lay not in revenge, but in the ability to forgive and act for the greater good. So ended this story, a story of hatred and revenge, of struggle and hope, where humanity won, not malice, and although it didn't end perfectly, it left a mark on people's hearts. Pobu, thank you for being with us on this emotional and important journey. We are very interested to hear your opinion about our story. How did it make you feel? Have you ever had any incidents of racism in your life? Share your thoughts in the comments, they are very important to us. We appreciate each of you and your stories. If you liked the video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss new exciting stories. We wish you a good day.